Yes. I'm excited here for Coffee with the Founder today because I'm bringing to the my good friend and colleague, Lonnie Lusardo, who has been supporting me in this conference for just a great number of years, and I've always appreciated that. And Lonnie, I'm excited that you're on. And the way I'm getting started, Lonnie, is really asking people if I met you on an elevator or at a outdoor event, just bump into you somewhere somehow. How would you explain who you are, what it is you do? I want our listeners to know, who is Lonnie Lusardo? What is your work, your research? What is it that you do? Can you just share that with our listening audience?
Thank you. I've never been asked that quite that way before. Fundamentally, for the past 30 years, I've been a consultant in the field of what we now call diversity and inclusion, or historically cultural competency training and development. A few years ago, I decided to take a curve away from that work and return to my journalism roots to study what the hate movement is all about. And that project turned into my book, The Anatomy of Organized Hate, Stories of Former White Supremacists and America's Struggle to Understand the Hate Movement. So what I would say my primary work now is, despite not being a strong religious person, I want to be the evangelist for the truth about hate groups and hate crimes. Because, well, I can explain that later. It's getting away, where if we weren't on an elevator, we'd be on the 100th floor by now.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's helpful though, because I was gonna ask you, after hearing about your work, particularly recently with hate groups and hate crimes. I mean, how do you describe that to people? Because it feels to me there's been an evolution of what that looks like in 2020 versus what it looks like in 1920, or maybe not, I don't know. So as someone who studies this work, share with people what hate crime, what hate groups are like, and how it's different in 2020 than it was, let's say 1920, but even the days of possibly 1980.
Okay, I'm going to do this in a slightly different way, but I will, with hope, answer your question completely. What I wanted to find out was, I call myself a recovering racist. I was raised in a racist, sexist, homophobic environment, like many other Americans. And I was able to change, and what precipitated my own change was when I was in the Navy and later in college, I realized I was gay and I had no idea what to do with it. Who do I tell? I couldn't tell my family, they were all homophobic. I couldn't tell my friends because it was before any recognition. And that's when I realized I can't put down people of other races. I can't put down any marginalized community because I'm one of them. And that changed everything for me. So in writing the book, I wanted to find out if I made that conversion to compassion and empathy as a result of something in my life, a life experience, what happens to extremists who are in the movement? So my goal in interviewing dozens of former white supremacists was to find out what was your background like? how did you get into the movement? What did you do when you were there? And all of the people I profile in my book were convicted of violent crimes, most of them hate crimes. They all served time in prison. And then I wanted to find out, what was the catalyst? There had to be a catalyst to get you out of the movement. What changed? What did it? What were those little things that happened? And then after 13 years of interviewing, I was able to connect what these folks have in common. And that is what I wanted to use as a main theme in the book. What can we learn from people who have been there and done all these nasty things? What changed for them, and how can we influence that for others? After I did that, I started investigating. I went back to my journalism roots and started investigating how the US government tracks hate groups and hate crimes. And what I discovered is two overarching themes that are in my book. One is what most Americans know or believe about hate groups and hate crimes is misleading, grossly incomplete, and in many cases dead wrong. And what I mean by that is the US government uses two departments, both in the Department of Justice, to quantify the number of hate crimes that happen every year. And each of these departments, the FBI and the Bureau of Justice Statistics, BJS, capture different data. The FBI tracks reports from 16 to 17,000 law enforcement agencies across the country. So every summer, these police departments and various other law enforcement agencies submit data to the FBI saying, here's the number of hate crimes that happened in our jurisdiction over the past year. The problem with that is, out of the 17,000 agencies, only fewer than 15% of law enforcement agencies actually submit data. So we're only hearing from a small number of police departments, and making assumptions about the rest of the country based on those few jurisdictions. If you can allow me this, based on that kind of data, the FBI and the federal government can say statistically the safest states to live, the race-free states to live, are states like Alabama, South Carolina, and Wyoming, because they have the lowest number of hate crimes. Well, we know that's nonsense, because the law enforcement agencies are not giving the data. So when I say what most Americans know is misleading, how can we know we're given a false sense of security when we don't hear from the vast majority of police departments how deeply the problem is affecting not just marginalized communities, the entire population. This fear, widespread fear. Another data point that's very significant is, whereas the FBI captures its data from police departments, the Bureau of Justice Statistics gets its data from the people. They do 250,000 surveys twice a year to determine, based on a survey of 80 questions. It's really an exhaustive process. Have you been subjected to a hate crime? Have you witnessed a hate crime? If you did, what can you tell us about the hate crime? Based on the FBI's data, for the past, I've been doing this work 13 years, and the number of hate crimes determined by FBI is somewhere around 7,000, 6,000, 7,000, maybe as high as 8,000 hate crimes a year nationwide. Well, that's a pretty good data point, but based on the BJS data, there are 250,000 hate crimes committed every year. Now, what do you believe? 7,000? 250,000? There's a lot of subjectivity in reporting hate crimes that most of us never think about. And I will tell you very directly, Eddie, I never wanted to know this shit. I never wanted to, I was so oblivious to it because I, like most Americans, and at least until I realized I was a sexual minority, as a white Christian, now gay, person born in the US, I didn't have much of an interest in what was happening in hate groups. I wasn't part of the target population until I had the Royal Daylights beat out of me in Key West, Florida. While I was staying there for a short time, I was the victim of a terrible hate crime. So what we also know, to go back to my statement of what we know is misleading, incomplete, or dead wrong, is just less than half of hate crimes are ever even reported to police. And we have to ask ourselves, why do people who are victims of hate crimes not report those hate crimes? And I have lots of answers to that. If you're an immigrant, you have a fear of being deported. If you're LGBTQ, and at the top of your power structure, you have a fear of being outed. If you're a religious minority, you have a fear of being stigmatized. So every population in a target group has different reasons to not report. That means we as people have to do new things to inspire victims of hate crimes to report them. Second big statement I make in my book, and this one I can get back to in more detail because I'm feeling you want to ask something else. The second statement is the big daddy of all hate groups, the model for all other hate groups, is the US government. And that is based on a history of racist policies going back to the time Columbus landed on what is now US soil. And I can explain that in more detail.
Yeah, so much has come up here, and so much I want to ask you. And I really feel like this is a decade of challenge and clarity when we're talking about hate crimes, hate groups, white supremacist groups, so on and so forth. Particularly as you mentioned, misinformation or ambiguity on the part of the populace, the general population.
Yeah.
So this is where I want to just really call on you as the expert, as someone who spent 13 plus years digging in, diving in, understanding, writing, researching. So trying to be, though, everyday people as opposed to academic. I think that's one of the things we try to accomplish at the conference is we want people to be able to feel like someone who's done the kind of scholarly work that you can deliver this message to the people at the local convenience store, which I take pride in feeling like that's something you can do very well. So that's where I want to go. If you're talking to a parent at a convenience store, having concern about white supremacist groups, hate crimes as it relates to their kids, let's say first a white parent. What is the recruitment? What is the activity happening around hate groups, hate crimes? Because you mentioned 7,000 versus 250,000. Are you seeing? I'm not sure. I sometimes say these groups are on the rise. These groups are more active. Can you give us a sense? How would you respond to that parent and saying you need to have some concern because yes, these groups are active? And what would be your kind of real piece of everyday people data that could help them understand that?
I think the one thing I'd want to convince a parent, particularly a parent of teenage children or a child, is, are you aware of what makes your child angry? Is your child angry? Is your child detached from a very solid supporting peer group? If that is the case, your child is very likely to be susceptible to the recruitment of a hate group. So I will try to solidify that more clearly by way of a response from one of the most violent people I interviewed in person. His name is Brian Widener. Brian told me in the context of an interview relating to nothing I had asked him about, he said, if you want to know how we recruit in the hate movement, it's very easy. All you have to do is go to a bar, go to an event, and find the angry person, the angry guy, because most of these groups are looking for men. And you find out from that person, you go and you chat them up and find out what pisses you off. When that person starts to any extent saying what bothers him, what Brian said is you guide that conversation away from them and talk about, it's not you, man. It's those, and I'll be generous in the terms because I can't even repeat what he would have said. It's those Black people who are taking our jobs away from us. It is those immigrants who are coming in and taking money away from white people who need it. It's those Jews who do this. It's those gays. And hey, why don't you come along and I want you to meet my buddies, have beer with us. And that sense of belonging starts from that very seed of feeling, I want to know what bothers you. And all these folks had a history of something bothering them. That's what parents need to know. If your child is not in part of a peer group, talk to that child to find out what are their anxieties, what are their fears. And I grew up in a family where we never touched that kind of a conversation. And for people who are outside of the target groups of hate groups, they don't have to think about that. But my role is to make them think about it. Make them think, what makes your child unlikely to be involved in an extremist behavior? Do you hear racist language? Do you hear jokes? Do you hear ethnic slurs that slam a particular ethnic group or religious group? What are the trends? That's what I want to communicate.
Yeah. Now, Lonnie, you mentioned something about, I think, just like political leaders and policy, I think you referred to as well, which has me thinking about what I feel is important is not to focus on one person, but to focus on this movement. Although it may be amplified or possibly attached to one person, I'm really interested in the movement of white supremacy, white supremacist groups, hate crimes, hate groups. And I was wondering, um, um, are we seeing more hate violence, hate crime and violence, white supremacy violence? Are we seeing more white supremacy, hate crime recruitment? Or are we seeing I don't want to know, I don't know if I should say a new way, but what about policy? What are the ways that white supremacy groups are impacting policy, which sometimes can often appear not as violent, but its result could be actually just that. So how do you talk about or talk with people about those three categories when you're talking about white supremacy and white supremacist groups?
You're asking a great question. I will answer with a statement I heard from the intelligence directors of both the Southern Poverty Law Center and Anti-Defamation League. And they both said to me when I was asking about the growth of the hate movement over the past 15 years and the evolution of those groups, what they both said to me is the hate movement today is insignificant. Now, I was stunned when I heard that. And I said, how could the hate movement be insignificant? How they justify the statement is by saying, based on data, only between 5%, between 3%, depending on who you talk to, between 3% and 5%, some will say up to 10% of hate crimes are committed by members of an identified organized hate group. The rest, the vast majority, 90% or more, are people who just go out and may be motivated by internalized racism or internal racism and see something inappropriate to their standards, and they act. So that could be a mixed race couple walking down the street, holding hands, being affectionate, a same-sex couple doing the same thing, or a synagogue celebrating something, or a Black church celebrating something. This person just goes totally bonkers and whips out a weapon and commits a mass murder or a violent crime. And so we give, as a population, we give more power to the hate movement than it really deserves. The real power of hate is in the one lone wolf extremists who are not organized in any way. And we have no way of knowing who they are until they strike. That's what communities need to know, because we may be creating a safe environment for extremists to act. In terms of violence, I want to reinforce the biggest, most violent hate crimes are generally committed by people who are not part of a hate group. So all the research that we have about hate groups, the number of hate groups, which rises in most years, sometimes it goes back like it did this year, but that doesn't tell us anything, because in a state like Washington, many hate groups are active one year and then fall off of the map the next year. That doesn't mean that a group of people who were in an identified organized hate group have suddenly found Jesus, have suddenly found compassion and empathy. No, they're just out there one-on-one people, former members of a group who are now on their own. They're the ones to watch. So we have to, as a people, elect, and I'm getting to the policy standard, we have to elect people who understand what the hate movement is in order to stop it. So at the end of my book, the last chapter is 7 ways to resist hate. You're gonna love this. Number 1, vote. Choose a candidate in every election and vet that candidate that you support based on what she or he has done or they have done in the concept of understanding the hate movement. There is one policy that needs to change at the federal level, and the likelihood of it changing right now is remote. And that is, we need to have a federal law that requires every law enforcement jurisdiction to submit hate crimes data to the FBI every year. Until such a law is in place, police departments, including the most racist in the country, are not motivated to submit the data. They're not motivated to research it. They have no reason to. There's no consequence if they do not. We need policies such as that to determine a way to manage hate rather than just allowing it to happen.
Yeah, wow, that's all right. I feel like 10 more questions out of that conversation there. But I think the one thing that resonates consistently as I'm hearing you through this second piece is white supremacy. And I'm thinking specifically about the time we're in now, that I don't think anyone's saying white supremacy, white supremacy, white supremacy publicly from any podium. Yet, you do see people saying Chinese virus. I don't hear people saying white supremacy, white supremacy, white supremacy, but you do hear people saying the people who are most likely to get this are people of color. And often what I find is when people report statistics, let's say housing statistics or income disparity statistics, they're always reporting the people on the bottom. And somehow that seems to miss the elevation of those on the top. Is it safe to say that we're seeing some of this happen right now, right before our eyes in reference to this pandemic? And maybe there needs to be a separate conversation, not only about hate, crime, hate groups, but possibly white supremacy. What's your thought around that?
Okay, fasten your seatbelt. So one thing we have to look at is the dynamic you're describing doesn't happen by default. It happens by design. The system is designed along the line of people thinking from the standpoint of white, Christian, straight, born in the US, able-bodied, They're not thinking, what do we know about, what do we really know? What facts do we know about all of the population? That's number one. Secondly, what has happened in the dialogue coming out of the White House and other government agencies is the term, catch this, the term white supremacy in criticizing members of the Trump administration is seldom used. The term that's used is white nationalism. And there's only a fine line of distinction between a white nationalist and a white supremacist. When we hear the criticism that there are active members of the Trump administration who are white nationalists, they are really white supremacists. And they are instituting and allowing policies that go along with the dynamic you described, where the mainstream, the white, straight Christian population guides everything. It's by design, it's not by default. So let me go back to my statement about the federal government being the big daddy of all hate groups. I base that on decisions and guideline orders from presidents historically, presidential orders, US Supreme Court decisions, and policies passed by Congress historically that have always targeted the very same groups that are the targets of hate groups today. So the biggest example is, how did the US population or the US government deal with the original people who lived on this land? Well, we figured out a way of how to get them out of the way. We just had mass genocide and slaughtered so many Native American people. Then we have acts from, the biggest one is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which totally denied any rights to Chinese people coming to the US. That was the biggest labor force for the railroads in the building of the Wild West. We hired these Chinese people who were treated like slaves because they had no rights because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Then we have any number of court cases that I'm not going to give you the detail of case A or case B, but cases that have gone before the Supreme Court that were just based on racist values, on no understanding of the distinction of human behavior between one population or another. So historically, the point I want to make is, historically, our government has created policies, laws, and presidential orders that have taken rights away from specific populations, have denied rights to specific populations, have denied voting rights to some people and other people. So I want to reinforce, the big daddy of hate groups is the federal government, and it's gone unchecked for right up until the current day, where we have a president instituting policies to deny access or entry into the US by certain populations.
Lonnie, you mentioned white supremacy, white nationalism. possibly being synonymous. I'm
Let me
wondering, where would you put alt-right and the alt-right movement in reference to that as well? And if you can respond quickly, I got another follow-up in addition to that.
So alt-right is another way of saying white nationalism. So let me explain what I understand to be the difference between white nationalism and white supremacy. White nationalism is a feeling of this nation being supported and run by white people, as it always has been. So we have a nation focused on white people. That's white nationalism. White supremacy is a higher level. It bumps up this belief of wanting a continuity of white thought and beliefs to a point of believing white people are superior and all these other groups are inferior for any number of reasons. And because they are inferior, depending on the group that one is aligned with or the ideology that one believes in, if someone is, if a population is so inferior, a white supremacist extremist will say that person doesn't deserve to have the same rights as the rest of us. That person doesn't deserve to walk the streets freely like the rest of us. That person, that population doesn't deserve to live. That's white supremacy.
And alt-right,
Alt-right,
where does that fall?
It's a made-up term for white nationalism.
Gotcha.
Rather than looking at what is alt-right. And to say a group is alt-right, what does that really mean? And, honestly, I don't know. What I do know is anybody who calls himself or herself a member of an alt-right movement is probably not going to support me, is probably not going to support you, is probably not going to support people with disabilities, homeless people, people of religious minorities. They're going to be thinking in their alt-right standard, white, 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 Christian, Christian, straight, all this other stuff. Does that make sense?
No, it doesn't make sense. This is why I'm asking. I'm trying to get this thing figured out myself. And I think it's a really important time because 1920, Ku Klux Klan, white supremacy had clear definitions, plain, simple, clear. Now you have this terminology of white nationalism, as I understand it, coming about in the last, at least 10 years, 5 years, but definitely most recently. And definitely on top of that, alt-right. And my follow-up to that one was going to ask you about Make America Great Again and some of what has been talked about in possibly blanketing all Republicans, all supporters of the presidency and Make America Great Again as white supremacists, as white nationalists, as alt-right, and really finding people and families and communities struggling around what it means to be Democratic, Republican, white nationalists, white supremacists, Make America Great Again. So what's your sense of kind of where we are now politically with these terms about in our society, with the work and research and the people you've interviewed who had direct contact with this white supremacy, white nationalist ideology, in the next 10 years, as we look at the challenges we're going to face, our kids are going to face, our communities are going to face, what's your sense of past, present, future?
Oh, Eddie, that's such a big question. First, let me go back to the term alt-right. I do not like that term. And the reason I do not like alt-right is it dignifies and gives legitimacy to this movement of thinking white privilege. It turns white privilege into a standard of government, when in fact, what continued use of alt-right denies us to look at specific groups like the Klan. And if we lump all those groups into a title called alt-right, we don't think KKK. We don't think white nationalist movement. We don't think Adam Waffen or these specific groups. We don't think of that. We hear alt-right. And if my parents or my siblings, who are all Republicans, hear that term, it's not going to punch their buttons the way it does to me, because that term alt-right robs us of an understanding of the violence these groups are actually doing against our neighbors, our friends, our family members. So to begin with, the term alt-right makes my skin crawl. Now, you asked more beyond that, and I frankly lost some of your question in my passion to answer about alt-right. Can you go back? So you were looking at past, present, future?
Yeah, well, I got 3 more questions, and one of them I'll repeat the one I just added to that alt-right piece. And it's related to what you were saying about family, where I feel like all Republicans are being associated with white nationalists, white supremacists, alt-right, as part of the Make America Great Again campaign political climate. And I'm just wondering what's your sense of where we are, where we're going in reference to politics and Republican, Democrat, so on and so forth. So I wanted, that was the other part of that alt-right piece that I wanted to ask you about. And the second question I was going to ask you is, coming from what you describe a racist background, does that help you as an anti-racist more, or does it hinder your evolving versus someone who comes from a more open, progressive, forward-thinking background, white person specifically? So I was going to ask you that as question number 2. And then, like I said, we got about 10 minutes, and I got one additional question to ask after you respond to those 2. So if you can be concise, I want to get all of those in.
You're breaking up, Eddie. Can you repeat that last?
Yeah, if you could just respond concisely so we can get all of those questions in, is what I was saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I got 2. I'm not sure I got the third question.
Yeah, I'll give you the third one after you're done with the first 2, hopefully.
Okay. So I think your assessment of Republicans and Democrats is close to the reality, but not completely accurate. There are some rays of hope among elected Republicans in both House and Senate at the state level, state legislatures, as well as a very few in US Congress. That is to say, how do we help Republicans get away from this feeling that unless they support a president who's clearly racist, they will not get reelected in their own district. That is absolute nonsense. I believe that because of the president's language, he is such a volatile person. People are afraid, Republicans are afraid to oppose him. And he will do his arm twisting, this is certainly at the federal level, to put those Republicans in line. That's why the impeachment fell flat. Only one Republican, that was Romney, voted to support it. And he took a lot of heat from other Republicans for doing that, particularly the president. So we have this dynamic of fear controlling the voting patterns of an entire party. I can't define it any better than that. I would love to talk in more detail about that.
I think I'm worried more about how racist white supremacists is being aligned only with Republican, and what's going to be the future of people associated with that party as they have to grapple with that as it relates to proven, unproven to the presidency and his stance. And that I ask you, secondly, as a part of that, coming from a background where, as you said, was a racist, now you're doing social justice work. Has that background helped you more, or does it continue to present more challenges for you as you evolve?
It has helped me more than it has hindered me. Let me go back to the political dynamic that you're describing. Part of the reason that dynamic continues is we have so few people of color elected to the US Congress. We have got to support very active people of color to run for congressional seats. Just look at the initial candidates for president. We had this very rich diversity of people running, but it quickly dwindled down to two old white men. Mm. It's like, and now one. We have got that. The dynamic you're describing is never going to change until we get more theoretically marginalized communities in Congress at both the state level and the federal level.
Yeah.
The question about how has my background affected my work, it has mobilized me in a way that I know what it's like to be racist. I was there up until my early 20s. As an adult, I used all the negative terms. I know what it's like. And I also know how hard it was for me to realize now I'm in a group that has been put down by all of the people in my family, in my peers, with very few exceptions. So I know what it feels like. And because I know what it feels like, I can defend not only my community, LGBTQ community, but any marginalized population. I've been there. I've walked in the mud. I had the shit kicked out of me on a sidewalk in Key West, Florida. I know what hate feels like. I know what discrimination feels like. And I want to communicate that to people who have no reason to understand it. They do have a reason.
Well, I appreciate that, Lonnie. I like I said, we have a lot to talk about. I feel like we could keep going another 30 minutes, but my time is really, really short. I wanted to just quickly get from you, what are what are you working on quickly? What's coming up for you? What's on the horizon in reference to your work and research as you look at the next decade? And then lastly, my fun question is, what are you watching? What are you streaming? What's helping you to learn as you're streaming and watching or listening podcast wise? And what's giving you some relief from some of the stuff that's going on, which I think sometimes we need. So what are you up to? And give me some streaming suggestions that's learning, knowledge, and that's gonna help me just get away for a second.
Okay. I'm not sure you're going to like or let me come back to that. So what's next is, currently my book is not very well publicized, and it can't get publicized because competing for time for a book versus a global pandemic means forget it. I'm not going to get entree into the media to get the kind of reviews for book sales to go up. In the meantime, what I'm doing is pursuing speaking engagements. So I can hit the ground in community groups, particularly in all the marginalized populations, to doing a workshop I call and have done at the White Privilege Conference for years, the truth about hate groups and hate crimes. And where I can explain everything I'm explaining to you in the context of an hour to an hour and a half conversation. The challenge right now is all of those talks have been postponed or canceled because we're not doing public meetings. But that's where I want to go. I see myself, although I have a love-hate relationship with this term, I see myself as the evangelist for the truth about hate groups and hate crimes, because nobody else has done this kind of research. There have been books about individual extremists who converted and left the movement, but no book before mine did a study of what do these folks have in common. That's what I want to tell. What I'm watching is, my background is a journalist. I spent 15 years as a journalist, mostly with metropolitan daily newspapers, and then with a number of newspapers as a freelance writer. My trust in American journalism has been deflated. We are now in an era of advocacy journalism. So if you look at the range, and you can find this online by going to the ideology of various media, you will find that the standard ABC, NBC, CBS are generally in the center, not far to the right, not far to the left. But we have advocacy journalism where we have Fox News for conservatives, and we have not so far to the left as Fox is to the right. We will have MSNBC and CNN. I don't want to rely on them for news. I want to rely on people I know. So I spend my time streaming sessions with friends of mine who are people of color, who are people in marginalized populations, to find out, how is this affecting you? How's it affecting me? That's what I want to know.
Anything that's taking you away, any show that you got, last 15 seconds.
I think Rachel Maddow is probably one. She can be a little bit farther to the left than I, but she's so grounded in facts.
Yeah.
and truth.
I was thinking like Netflix or Prime, or you watching anything there that's taking
I
you
will
away?
watch movies only for an escape, Eddie.
Oh,
I
my
have to
goodness.
escape.
Yes, yes. Well, listen, Lonnie, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. I'll definitely look forward to being in touch, and we'll let you know when this is going to air. This is episode number 2 of Coffee with the Founder, and I always appreciated you supporting me. And you know that we will support you and be in partnership with you as long as you'll stay in partnership with us. Take care of yourself.
Back at you. I love you, Eddie. Take care.
Love you, my brother. Peace.
Peace.